Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Good evening and welcome. Delighted you're with us this evening. I'm Bill Kelly, the president of the CUNY Graduate Center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Great Issues Forum. The Graduate Center is the doctorate granting wing of the City University. We educate 4,500 students across 31 academic disciplines and are home to 29 research centers and institutes. Along with our teaching and research commitments, we discharge our obligation to serve the citizens of this remarkable city by mounting an extensive series of public programs. Our objective, consistent with CUNY's role as the nation's largest public university, the last count 236,000 undergraduate students, is to vitalize the public sphere, to encourage the kind of informed discussion essential to the health of a democratic polis. The marquee event of that programming is the Great Issues Forum. Each year, the forum explores critical issues of our time through a single thematic lens. Our current focus is power. In a series of public conversations featuring artists, intellectuals, and policymakers, as well as through our academic seminar, website, and blog, the Great Issues Forum examines the ways in which various forms of power, political, economic, cultural, military, educational, function in the world. Upcoming Great Issues events include Naomi Klein, Joseph Stiglitz, and Hernando de Soto on economic power. That's on October 20th. You're cordially invited to that. And Tom Stoppard and Derek Walcott on the power of culture and art in a globalizing world. We've also scheduled a rich array of other more specialized conversations on the subject of power. Those events are listed on the forum's website, greatissuesforum.org. At that site, you can also find podcasts of many of our events, as well as an online seminar and blog featuring commentary from a wide range of prominent writers and thinkers. We invite you to visit that site and to participate in the digital conversation it encourages. We're also delighted through the Macaulay Honors College to involve CUNY undergraduates in the forum's public events and in our online seminar. I'd like to extend a particular welcome to the Macaulay students who are with us this evening. Funding for the Great Issues Forum was provided by the 2007 Carnegie Corporation of New York's Academic Leadership Award, presented to CUNY's Chancellor, Matthew Goldstein. We're deeply grateful to the Carnegie Corporation and to its president, Vartan Gregorian, who is with us this evening, as well as to Chancellor Goldstein. Our discussion this evening will be moderated by Tom Weiss, who has been instrumental in shaping this series. Professor Weiss is the Presidential Professor of Political Science at the Graduate Center and Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies, where he is co-director of the UN Intellectual History Project. He is President of the International Studies Association, Chair of the Academic Council of the UN System, and the recipient of the Grand Prix Humanitaire de France in 2006 and the Médaille d'Honneur de la Ville de Marseille in 2008. I'd now like to introduce our distinguished participants, starting with Zbigniew Brzezinski. Mr. Brzezinski is a counselor and trustee for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as the Robert Osgood Professor of American Foreign Policy at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. From 1977 to 1981, he served as the National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter. In 1981, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his role in the normalization of U.S.-Chinese relations and for his contributions to the human rights and national security policies of the United States. He has been a member of the faculties of Columbia and Harvard and is the author of many books, the most recent of which is Second Chance: Three Presidents and the Crisis of American Superpower. Nicholas Kristof is a widely read columnist for the New York Times, where he previously served as associate managing editor, responsible for the Sunday Times. In 1990, Kristof and his wife Cheryl Wu Dunn, also a Times journalist, won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of China's Tiananmen Square democracy movement. They were the first married couple to win a Pulitzer Prize for journalism. Kristof won a second Pulitzer in 2006 for what the judges called his, quote, graphic, deeply reported columns that at personal risk focused attention on genocide in Darfur, and that gave voice to the voiceless in other parts of the world. He has also won, among other prizes, the George Polk Award, the Overseas Press Club Award, the Michael Kelly Award, the Online News Association Award, and the American Society of Newspaper Editors Award. Mr. Kristof and Ms. Wu Dun are the authors of China Wakes, The Struggle for the Soul of a Rising Power, and of Thunder from the East, Portrait of a Rising Asia. Mary Robinson. Mary Robinson served from 1990 to 1997 as the first female president of the state of Ireland, and from 1997 to 2002 as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Her presidential term was marked by her commitment to developing nations and her efforts to link Ireland's historical and cultural tradition to the issues facing the world. In 1992, she was the first head of state to visit Somalia following the crisis there, and she was the first head of state to visit Rwanda in the aftermath of genocide. The recipient of many accolades, Ms. Robinson is a member of the Royal Irish Academy and the American Philosophical Society. She is also honorary president of Oxfam International and chair of the Council of Women World Leaders. Now based in New York, she is the chair of Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative, which promotes equitable trade and development, more humane migration policies, and the human right to health. She's also a professor of practice at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. We are delighted and grateful to each of you for joining us this evening. Before I turn things over to Professor Weiss, may I remind you to turn off your cell phones and also to say that video or audio taping is prohibited. Professor Weiss, the floor is yours, sir.
Well, thanks, Bill. And let me add my own words of welcome to Bill's to this first Great Issues Forum. We're going to look at political power this evening. This form of power, like all forms of power, for good or for ill, ideas matter. How we think about power actually has a great amount of impact on how we respond to it. The backdrop for me for the conversation this evening is actually the contrast between American exceptionalism, that city on the hill, which has led us in the last 8 years, at least the way I interpret it, as going it alone far too frequently and not looking for allies. At the same time, we have a lot of problems, lots of the ones we're going to talk about this evening, whether it's terrorism, whether it's pandemics, whether it's economic disruptions, that require cooperation. The former Secretary General called these somewhat poetically problems without passports. They don't look at borders. Interestingly, 2 weeks ago, Christian Amanpour interviewed 5 former secretaries of state. They didn't agree on very much, but the one thing they did agree on was that it was important that the next president, the next administration, look for more partners. So this conversation this evening is going to revolve around these themes. I'm delighted that Mary Robinson, Nick Kristof, and Zbigniew Brzezinski are here this evening. They have a lot of experience in this arena. What we've decided to do is I've collected some questions from colleagues, friends, students here, and from the Macaulay Honors students. I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to start with Dr. Brzezinski. The second person can comment on that comment, but I'm going to try to move the conversation along to a related topic. The first topic is going to be the projection of global power. Paul Kennedy talks about the rise and fall of great powers. It's very difficult to determine where we are on this curve, but last month something happened. Robert Kagan wrote in the Washington Post, and I quote, "Historians will come to view August 8, 2008 as a turning point no less significant than November 9, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. Russia's attack on sovereign Georgian territory marked the official return of history." I have some colleagues on the 5th floor who don't think that history ended. But anyway, Mr. Kagan does. In the aftermath of the Cold War, I think that we got used to being unchallenged. It seems to me that the Russian invasion changed that virtually overnight. So my first question to you, Dr. Brzezinski, is how do you characterize this change? Are we all Georgians now, as Mr. McCain would argue, or is there something in the argument that Russia's stance reflects a more traditional concern about being surrounded, that perhaps we ought to think about holding off on Ukraine's and Georgia's membership in NATO, and maybe, in your country of birth, Poland, stopping the construction of missiles. Which of these two sides do you come down on?
I would say that the Russian position reflects, in some respects, the waning of Russia's imperial nostalgia, which is still there and which was reflected in the kind of knee-jerk reaction to the conflict in Ossetia. But it is a waning imperial nostalgia. Unlike the other great empires that came to an end in the 20th century, Great Britain, France, in much nastier fashion, Germany and Japan, all of which have come to terms with the new reality that they're no longer empires. I think there is still a residual inclination, particularly within the top levels of the Russian elite, and notably Putin himself, to yearn for a renewed imperial status. And I think the conflict to some extent reflects that. But that doesn't resolve the policy issue. And from the standpoint of policy, I think we have two objectives that we have to seek simultaneously, and it is difficult to relate them because to some extent they are in conflict. On the one hand, we want to draw Russia into the West. I think the long-range prospects for Russia are only good if Russia becomes part of the West. If it tries to go it alone, for a variety of reasons I could spell out in more detail, it's going to encounter growing difficulties. So we have to suck Russia in. But that's a tedious and difficult process because of this lingering inclination still to resume imperial status, to try to regain it by force. And I think we have to view this as a process in which the Europeans ought to be taking the lead. The Soviet Union was a global challenger to the United States in the era of global polarization, global conflict. Today, what Russia is doing has more implications in the European context than in the global context. We should support the Europeans, but the Europeans are the ones who have to try to both persuade the Russians to desist from doing things which are counterproductive, while at the same time trying to draw them in. And there are a variety of specific steps that we could be taking. On the other hand, we also have to be aware of the fact that we have two stakes in Georgia. One is strategic and one is moral. The strategic stake is that Georgia is the access for Europe and for us to the energy resources of the Caspian, specifically of Azerbaijan, but also beyond in Central Asia. And if Georgia falters, that is cut off, and Azerbaijan falls again under the sway of Russia. And secondly, we have a moral commitment. Georgia, for all of its imperfections, is a democracy. And it's not an accident that a great deal of Russian, and particularly Putin's hostility towards Georgia, can be dated very precisely to the Revolution of the Roses. And Putin has made it very clear that he would like to see the Georgian government changed and so forth. So we have to find ways of supporting Georgia, and we're going to try to rehabilitate it economically. The most difficult part will arise when we and the Europeans have to ask ourselves, and we'll have to ask ourselves, if we're going to give Georgia $1 billion, which we have promised, Bush has promised, Biden proposed it initially, so it's a national consensus in America. It's a little bit like giving $1 million to a bank office in a district in a city in which there's no police and rampant crime. Do you want to leave $1 billion there? So we have to bite the bullet on how do we make Georgia more secure and make it more difficult at the next time the Russian tanks, which came within 2.5 hours of Tbilisi just a month and a half ago, don't just roll into Tbilisi the way they rolled into Prague in 1968. So that is the basic dilemma. We'll have to operate on both levels. I don't want to take more time and go into specifics, but that is the basic framework within which we have to approach this issue.
Thank you. Well, Nick, I'd like you to follow up on that and to which extent you come down on those two sides of the coin. But I'd also like to think about one of the central dynamics during the Cold War, which was nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence and nuclear brinkmanship. And recently you've also, with a resurgent Russia into the nuclear equation, we have to introduce North Korea and Iran. And I'm sort of wondering in the second part of the answer whether you might look at how the messy transition in North Korea might lead to new opportunities, and what might happen in Iran if, as seems plausible, the continued development of centrifuges leads to a armed Iran.
So I've got to solve the problem of Georgia, Iran, and North Korea. And as you were speaking, it occurred to me that this $1 billion that we're going to supply Georgia, maybe instead of giving Georgia cash, we could give them these, bank loans that we acquire from money center banks and solve some problems at the same time.
700 and 1 million.
Yes. On the question of, I think there's actually a certain parallel here, in that I think one of the things that democracies in general and American democracy in particular often do badly is have calibrated reactions. And in the case of Russia, for example, there's no doubt that Russia has bullied not only Georgia, but also Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, and has behaved very badly in lots of places. I'm afraid that the instinctive response to that has been, well, we should admit Georgia into NATO. And I frankly would get nervous about us tethering ourselves through NATO to President Saakashvili. On the broader problem of North Korea and Iran, I think that there too we have, that these are incredibly complex issues, and that partly because we in the press don't handle complexities and nuance terribly well, they become very difficult to adjudicate. And I think that it becomes very tempting when you have a nasty country that behaves badly and cheats to get on one's high horse and adopt a kind of a very tough position that becomes self-defeating. And in the fall of 2002, for example, we determined that North Korea was cheating on its nuclear commitments by developing a highly enriched uranium program. As a result, we cut off the separate plutonium agreed framework that we had, and the result is that North Korea, which hadn't developed a single nuke under the Clinton administration because of the agreed framework, which was highly problematic in lots of ways, but still, it had halted the plutonium program. Since then, it's developed about a half dozen nukes, and it was very emotionally satisfying to tell North Korea, you've cheated, we're going to stop the agreed framework. But the upshot has been more proliferation, I think more risk. And I would fear that in the case of Iran, we may be headed to a similar situation where Iran is, the risks of proliferation from Iran are incredibly real. And not least is that proliferation will spread throughout neighboring countries, and Saudi Arabia could be encouraged to get a weapon. If Saudi Arabia does, Egypt will as well, and so on. And yet, a military. John McCain has periodically said that the one thing worse than a military strike on Iran would be Iran getting a nuclear weapon, and I think that thinking is very easy to understand. And in fact, I think it's a lousy solution, not least because it would probably delay an Iranian nuclear program only a few years, partly because we don't know exactly what to hit, and it would cement the Iranian regime in place for years or decades to come. And so I fear that in democracy we tend to rush toward very easy to understand, emotionally satisfying solutions to incredibly complex areas, and part of that, I'm afraid, is the way we in the press handle things.
Barry, I wonder whether I might permit myself to shift gears a minute here and stay in the region in Iraq and Afghanistan and ask you to comment a little on the United States and the United Kingdom's decision to go to war, and the fact that we have this thing called a UN Charter, but the bonds of that charter are very weak when you have Gulliver across from you. And ironically, to come back to my introductory remarks, the reasons we supposedly went there, terrorism and links to WMDs, certainly were not there. But even if we wanted to do something about that and to do something about a stable Iraq, it seems that we have to do something totally different than what we've been doing. So I just wanted to ask you how long, as an outsider and a guest in the United States, how long do you think it's going to take for the United States to recover its reputation in the world? And are there 2 or 3 things that you might say symbolically or actually might happen in the first quarter of next year that would announce that the United States is back somewhere near the multilateral arena?
Tom, I've just been noticing you don't ask one question, you ask about 10. And it's a mental effort to keep up with your questions. But I'd still like, because you allowed us to do that,
sure,
to link a little bit with what Nick was saying about Iran. I think it's an example where there hasn't been enough of that balance between what we call the hard power and soft power. And I'm saying that because actually, as it happens, I'm going to Tehran quite shortly as a member of the Club of Madrid. The Club of Madrid is a club of exalted has-beens like myself, former presidents and prime ministers. And one of our members, a former prime minister of Norway, Kjell Bondevik, who in fact is a Lutheran pastor, has been developing a very close relationship with President Khatami, the former president of Iran, and there have been exchanges, and we're now going, Kofi Annan will be going as well, and some other members, about 5 or 6 of us, and some religious leaders. And I think it's important to open up avenues for discussion. And I noted, you mentioned the debate with the 5 former secretaries of state, which I watched with great interest, and all of them, including Henry Kissinger, said we should be trying to open up. So I think that's one of the missing links. Now, what were the other 10 questions? Yes, okay. You asked about war, and you didn't initially specify, and I think it's probably good for me as a human rights person to distinguish between the initial going to war in Afghanistan. I remember, because I was serving as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the incredible sense that I had when I saw those scenes over and over again of planes full of people and tanks, gasoline tanks, hitting buildings with to kill as many people as possible. And going into my office, coming to ground zero, meeting the grieving families, meeting the FEMA, and then saying, what does this mean in human rights terms? And we were clear. These were crimes against humanity. And there is a clear way of following up on that under international human rights law. You bring the perpetrators to justice. And that justified military intervention in Afghanistan because the Taliban refused to surrender Osama bin Laden. So that was a different basis altogether. And what makes me very sad, really, because it's more than sadness, is that the war in Iraq, which I spoke out against beforehand and said this is not justified under any of the criteria of what we might call a responsibility to protect. It didn't fit any of the international standards of when you can go into another country militarily and regime change. And the sad thing is, more and more we're equating the war in Afghanistan with the war in Iraq. They're 2 rather similar wars, and that means we've lost the moral high ground in Afghanistan as well if we're not careful. So very briefly, there is a huge amount of ground that will have to be regained, especially from a human rights perspective, because of Guantanamo Bay, because of the ambivalence on torture, because of Abu Ghraib. And the more I travel in African countries and in the Middle East, the more I worry about just how much ground has been lost. But at the same time, I think it can be regained if the new President of the United States takes a very principled approach. And it would have to be very clear, going back to the commitments under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention Against Torture, being quite unambiguous about it, closing Guantanamo Bay as soon as possible, and reasserting. And after that, I think it would take quite a lot of work to be done in building alliances. And because the United States is in a different position now, militarily, and I believe because of the last strange month of September, economically, it's a time to forge relationships. It makes sense.
Dr. Brzezinski, do you agree with those sets of priorities that could be undertaken early in 2009 by whichever candidate is president?
Well, I wouldn't agree if the formula is whichever president is president, because I think it makes a lot of difference whether you have a president who sings at a political rally, literally sings, bomb, 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 bomb Iran, as some sort of an indication of what his policy prescriptions are. I don't think that would be exactly enhancing American global standing. So, actually, I really do think, and obviously it sounds partisan. Let's go a little further than that. It is partisan. I do think that if 90 days from now the president raises his hand and swears allegiance to the Constitution, and that president is someone who is not of the party now in power, American image will change a lot that very moment. Yeah. And then, of course, the president would follow by doing the things that need to be done. Because the sad thing is that for decades, scores of decades, the symbol of America to the world was the Statue of Liberty. That was the first thing I saw as a child when I arrived one misty November day in America and I saw the Statue of Liberty. But lately, it's been Guantanamo that is the symbol of America to the world. And I think a new president who is identified clearly with the rejection of these policies would immediately change America's image, and I think would proceed to do these things. However, having said that, I think the problem of Iraq is going to be more manageable for us than the problem of Afghanistan. The problem of Iraq, which was never connected with 9/11 or with Al-Qaeda, one way or another is coming to an end. The Iraqi government wants a date set for leaving. The Iraqi parliament wants a date set for leaving. President Bush is now talking on behalf of 2011 for leaving. And one candidate for president says that 2010 is doable. I think we ought to try and have no illusions that it's going to be stable and peaceful the moment we leave. Iraq will have to shake itself down to some sort of internal normalcy, because right now there are 150,000 American troops preventing Iraq from being Iraq. And we have to face that reality, that our presence is part of the problem. Afghanistan is a deeper problem, because when we went into Afghanistan to overthrow Taliban, as Mary correctly said, because it sheltered Al-Qaeda, even though it was not itself involved in the plot of 9/11, we did it with only 300 American soldiers. 300 American soldiers. We put in 300 American soldiers in October and November of 2001. And within several weeks, we overthrew the Taliban. Why? Because we had most of the Afghans on our side. They thought of us as friends because we helped them against the Soviets. But we have stayed. My advice to the administration at the time in a memo was, go in, overthrow the Al-Taliban, see if you can get the Al-Qaeda and kill them, and then leave. Don't stay. But we have stayed. And now we're getting dug in more and more, and we're beginning to emulate unintentionally what the Soviets did. The Soviets went in on the illusion that a bunch of pro-Marxist intellectuals in Kabul can help the Soviets to create a Soviet satellite. We are operating on the assumption that a bunch of pro-Western Afghan modernizers in Kabul can help us create a modern Afghan state. And we're using military force, 60,000 troops now. 300 did the job. We now have 60,000 in Afghanistan. And the Taliban, which when we crushed it was reduced to about 2,000 scattered insurgents, now has about 20,000 armed people, and the numbers are increasing. And we're now beginning to spill the violence over into Pakistan. If we're not careful, we're going to be stuck in Afghanistan, Pakistan, for far longer than in Iraq. And don't forget, time flies quickly. We have now been in Iraq for 7 years. That's a pretty long time. We're going to be stuck in Pakistan and Afghanistan for a decade or more. We can kiss our global goodbye, preeminence goodbye. So the next president will have to address that. I don't think I can do it right now, not in the political climate. But speaking for myself, not for any candidate, I think we have to demilitarize and politicize our presence in Afghanistan, try to cut deals with different segments of Taliban in the different provinces, try to give them a lot of economic assistance and money, including, in effect, bribes, and try to let the situation settle on itself. Because the Taliban itself is not a radical jihadist anti-American organization. It is a primitive, medieval almost, Afghan religious fundamentalist reaction to the destruction of that society by the Soviets. But if we now link this with the various ethnic conflicts in Pakistan, we're going to be stuck. So we have to make a very fundamental strategic choice, which we haven't prepared yet to address. And I don't think we can intelligently address that in the course of the presidential campaign.
Well, Nick, you were not shaking your head negatively to any of that. But I'd like to continue along the lines of terror 9/11, because one of the scuffles in the debate, first presidential debate, concerned, are we safer or not, since September 12th, 2001. Those two words, 9/11 and terror, seem to be trump cards that sort of halt conversations. And I'm wondering whether you think the term global war on terrorism makes sense as a way to frame the issue. And what might make the country safer on September 12th next year?
I don't entirely agree with your prescription on Afghanistan, but I do profoundly agree with the notion that we often end up creating an opposition that, I mean, the irony is that we exist as a country because George III didn't appreciate the power of nationalism here, and our biggest mistake in foreign policy in country after country after country is that we don't appreciate the power of nationalism, whether it's in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, or in Iraq. And
can I interrupt and intrude here? When you were speaking, I was thinking of the British troops who came to Northern Ireland in the late 60s, came to protect the Catholics. A year later, they were part of the problem. They were the occupying army.
But also, thank God, in fighting the IRA, the British government wasn't saying we're fighting Catholic terrorism, which would have united all the Irish against them. And we're doing that, and now we're talking about terror all the time.
Sorry to interrupt.
And I mean, you can see that in Pakistan in particular. And Pakistan is now, I mean, it is astonishing the downward trajectory in Pakistan. Is a country that I love, have traveled a lot in, that has tremendous potential and also is incredibly dangerous. If Afghanistan falls apart, that's terrible, but if Pakistan falls apart with its nuclear weapons, I mean, that's an entirely different order of magnitude of a problem. And we spend approximately $10 billion in Pakistan, aid to Pakistan, since 9/11. It has resulted in a Pakistan that is more wobbly than ever, where the suspicion of the U.S. is enormous, and where the Northwest and indeed the West is incredibly dangerous to go in. You know, imagine if instead of spending all that $10 billion, we had spent, say, $1 billion for education. Then, you know, there's certainly, education is no panacea. It doesn't provide any immediate benefit. But over time, it would create, I think, a different kind of a Pakistan. And one of the real problems in rural Pakistan when you go around is that if there was a local madrasa funded by Saudi Arabia, for example, that at least provided an education to local people, and they appreciated that. It was a lousy education, but it was something. And then under American pressure, some of those madrasas were closed, and there was nothing else provided in its place. And if, you know, at a time, if Saudi fundamentalists end up coming across as having a more pro-education agenda in rural Pakistan than the U.S., then of course we're in trouble there.
Mary?
Well, he didn't answer anything about Afghanistan. No?
Well, I mean, in Afghanistan, I would be worried about us.
Sorry, it was the terrorism.
Global war on terror.
Yeah, see, we're getting lost in all these questions.
You see, I thought I was adopted. I've been around politicians too long. I thought, you know, if somebody asks you a question, ignore the question and just answer whatever you want. But if you insist on, I mean, you're absolutely right that the global war on terror, it's not a war. I mean, it's a jihad in a sense against a concept, and it's endless. There's no particular metric about how you get there, and we obviously want to minimize terror, and we can do that in a lot of different ways, and some of those tools are military, and some of those I think are funding schools in a lot of places, and some of those are closing Guantanamo, and all the kinds of things that we've talked about.
I'm going to, in terms of, I think a word you've used before, the revolution in human rights. I mean, we've come a long way in 65 years, but one of the questions that's buried here, I'll ask it more simply, is from some of the students who are asking, how do you maintain your sense of enthusiasm, optimism, occasionally smile, when you see Robert Mugabe and the generals in Myanmar? How do you keep yourself, and how do you tell students not to get on that slippery slope of cynicism and nihilism?
I'm very keen to answer that question, but I also wanted to just pick up a little bit.
I thought you wanted one question.
Yeah, just on the war on terrorism, because I agree with what Nick has said, but I also feel very sad that we use this paradigm of a war on terrorism, and it's quite hard to explain why that has been worrying. As I mentioned earlier, it was legitimate to use military force to find the perpetrators of crimes against humanity. So, going the route of crimes against humanity and bringing perpetrators to justice and having a lot more cooperation on that is not soft. It's very tough. It's very focused, and you don't lose your focus. Whereas the war on terrorism began an erosion of protection of rule of law and standards of human rights that America had stood for. And it's understandable, because if you're at war, it's easier to sort of be slightly panicked into taking measures, and security becomes predominant. And the Patriot Act went through without real scrutiny and all of these things. But it wasn't just the United States. This is really the point I just wanted to make briefly. I've just taken part in a study, and we're about to finalize a report, at least I hope we are, we're trying to, where we're looking at the impact of what various countries did since 9/11 that has eroded rule of law and protection of human rights around the world. And we've had hearings in 20 countries, including in Washington and in Moscow and in parts of Africa, in the UK, in Belfast, etc. And it's very worrying because countries that don't have the checks and balances this country has, the Supreme Court, the media itself, academics, all these things that kick in, the American Bar Association, very concerned about erosion of rule of law and very vocal on the point, etc. There's an erosion going on, and then when you try to challenge it, you're told the standards have changed. And the reference point for the standards having changed is the United States. So I just wanted to park that.
I'm afraid that after this discussion, you may be arrested and sent off to Guantanamo, which would prove the point.
You see, that is proving my point about the balances. I speak, I hope I speak kind of constructively, but I do speak very freely in criticizing the United States, although I'm living here, and I have never for a moment felt in any danger of the orange jumpsuit and being taken away, precisely. But if I were to say the same things in some other countries, maybe I would be in fear. And that gets back to your point about how it is, because I have seen terrible things, especially during the 5 years when I was High Commissioner. And funnily enough, they stay with me. I have a whole string of memories that I can evoke 1 inch below my mind. I think you probably have the same, Nick, because you've covered it. And it means that you empathize and you know, and you actually, you almost feel the pain. It seems a strange thing to say, but it is very personal. But I've always felt that if you want to just describe the bad things, you take all the oxygen out of doing anything about it. So the glass has to be at least a little bit, not half full, but it's what do we do about it? That to me is the human rights response. And I find that at grassroots level, the people who are suffering most are the most resilient, the most courageous, the most innovative, and we're not there enough to remove the barriers they're trying to cope with and give them the leg up they deserve. So it is a human rights approach to galvanize and harness resources to problem solve, to make things happen.
So the glass is 5%
sometimes,
full, not 95%
sometimes
empty.
there's only a drop in there. But
Dr. Brzezinski, I wonder, Much of this human rights and accountability discussion started with Nuremberg, and I was looking at a quote the other day from the chief prosecutor who opened the comments, that 4 great nations flushed with victory and stung with injury stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. Our conversation this evening is about this contrast between power and reason. And I wonder, is there something that the next administration might do to make the system, make senior decision makers and not bad apples in Abu Ghraib responsible for their actions? Is there a way to regain that idealism that was so prevalent in the chief prosecutor's opening comments?
I think it's possible, but I think in the United States, it has to start within the U.S. system itself. That is to say, we have to return to some real notion of accountability. We have slid into a pattern in which the notion of accountability is reduced to presidential responsibility, in which the president acknowledges responsibility for misdeeds or violations of the law or really serious crimes, and then as a consequence, no one is brought to account. I think it's rather striking, for example, that there have been war crimes committed in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, for example. Has any senior official been brought to account for that? Either civilian, top civilian, or top military? The answer is no. In fact, none of the crimes committed in Iraq have resulted in a serious accountability process involving people who either were responsible directly or created conditions in which these kinds of crimes could occur. So it has to begin within the US government. I do have to say that to some extent, the change in the appointment, in the choice of Secretary of Defense that has taken place has moved things forward. I think Mr. Rumsfeld, in effect, had a tendency to view these things as somehow or other the inevitable accompaniments of warfare. And, you know, stuff happens, he said. I was rather struck that on somewhat less grievous issues, but nonetheless important issues, the current Secretary of Defense, Mr. Gates, has brought some very senior officials to accountability and has publicly fired them. He made them responsible because they were at the top of the chain of command. I think we have to move to that, both in the military sector, but also to some extent more generally in terms of foreign policy. If we have a foreign policy that alienates most of the world, if we have a specific foreign policy that promises to deliver peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and then fails to do so, very evidently, somehow or other, there should be accountability for that. At the very least, political accountability, not necessarily judicial accountability. Because if we don't do that, then we are in effect replicating on the political level what we have already slid into on the financial, economic level. You know, we're right now in the midst of a very serious crime, very serious crisis at the same time. The crime is self-indulgence on a massive scale and personal greed, and we're unable to grapple with it effectively. And in fact, public outrage has become so intense that rational, painful, necessary, even moral compromises that are needed are then rejected. And the problem becomes worse. So we are, in a sense, facing a generalized crisis of responsibility and accountability in our political system. I hope, in a way, it's going to be a wake-up signal to the American people, because if there is no change, if there's no real awareness of the need for redressing these imbalances, the era of American preeminence in the world, politically, economically, but especially morally, is going to come to a rapid end.
Speaking of moral leadership, we've gotten this far in the debate, and I had actually wanted to come here earlier. Nick, Kristof, you've spent a long time, since the year 2003, crying in the wilderness about Darfur. That didn't come up in the presidential debate. It's seemingly off the agenda these days. Mary mentioned the responsibility to protect humanitarian intervention. A few weeks ago in the London Review of Books, Jeremy Harding wrote that the notion of humanitarian intervention has little to show for its brief appearance on the international stage. It arrived too late for Rwanda, gestured helplessly at Bosnia, and at last, in 2003, it was discovered in the arms of shock and awe, where it died of shame. I personally would dispute some of where we've gone, but I'd like to know where you think a new administration could make a difference in stopping this slow-motion genocide, crimes of shocking, conscience-shocking nature. There's something to be done quickly or even in the medium term to put a little muscle behind our rhetoric about genocide.
Yeah. At the end of the day, the problem of Darfur is difficult and challenging, just as Rwanda was, just as Bosnia was, just as genocides always are. But what we lack most of all isn't tools, it's political will. And, the reality is, if this was going on in Quebec, it would be a terrible problem, but of course we would have solved it and addressed it by now. Sierra Leone was a terrible problem, and then partly because Madeleine Albright showed up and for a few hours and was photographed with a small child who had had its arms cut off, that captured, television images captured the imagination, and so there was a will to do something about it, particularly in Britain, and that led to, so, you see that whenever there is more attention posed on Darfur, that then Sudan doesn't stop attacks, but it reduces the number. It reduces the number of attacks on the camps in particular, the offensives. I think that a no-fly zone imposed from Chad, not in the sense of keeping planes up all the time, but the way military planners have looked at it, if Sudan used its offensive aircraft there to bomb villages, then afterward, a few days later, we would take out one of their military aircraft on the ground. I think that would have a major effect improving things. France has dramatically improved the situation in Chad next door with its very small European force. I think we could work much more internationally and try to, if China were to cut off arms transfers to Sudan, that would completely transform the picture. And so I think there are a lot of levers. There's no magic bullet, but there is, in a sense, magic buckshot that I think would help. In the tradition of answering questions that you've asked other people,
sure.
You raised the issue with Mary about this question of one goes to places and how does one avoid coming back just incredibly depressed? And I must say that whether it's Darfur or elsewhere, I come back surprisingly. You see mothers whose children have been thrown into bonfires because of the color of their skin and the tribe they belong to, and it's horrible. But at the same time, side by side with the very worst atrocities, you see the very best of humanity. You see people aid workers who every day risk their lives to help people of different tribes, different religions, whom they may not meet again. You see local people with just displaying incredible courage, sharing nothing. And so I actually come back usually feeling, on the one hand, just horrified by the atrocities, but at the end of the day, feeling somewhat better about humanity. And what I really find depressing is when I come back and see young people whose greatest expression of their humanity is the sneakers they wear, or the cell phone that they have, or some other purely material application that doesn't attempt to address these incredible things that people truly are trying to address. Some very courageous people are trying to address in Darfur.
Yeah. I'm glad you answered Mary's question. Dr. Brzezinski raised the elephant in the room of the Middle East. We were saying earlier you're about to leave for the Middle East. It seems to me, in New York perhaps especially, but also in Washington, it's a little hard to have a conversation about this topic. Our academic colleagues, John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt, found out what happens if you try to open a subject. And we don't need to discuss their research methodology and what they've been criticized for, but I would like to know what you think might happen in the next administration that would get us beyond the platitudes of Israel is our ally, and we could have an honest conversation about what it would take to make peace in the Middle East.
I agree with you that it's the most difficult issue to discuss in a fair and a way that communicates and doesn't kind of have people looking for codes of what you're really saying. It was the most difficult in the UN system when I was serving as High Commissioner for Human Rights. I was determined to bring a human rights lens, and I couldn't believe how difficult it was, because I was being seen to be partisan, because I saw human rights violations on the Palestinian side. Therefore, I was in that camp and so on. And both sides, both Israelis and Palestinians, consider themselves in the UN context to be victims. In the Palestinian, it's because why don't they enforce these Security Council resolutions, etc. On the Israeli side is why are we targeted all the time in the Human Rights Council and elsewhere. And I had an interesting experience as we're talking about political power. I was a non-executive president of Ireland for 7 years, the first woman president, and I didn't have the political power of running the government. That was what the Taoiseach and his government did, and I had to find a space beside them. But I found that by being able to use symbols and language and connection, and particularly working with grassroots, I could have a lot of influence. And I think it's time to open up the influence in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. That's actually what I'll be doing in November. I'm going there for a particular event, but it's an opportunity to recognize just how much women from both the Israeli and Palestinian side work constantly and courageously. These are the real heroes together. Young people. There's a joint business council, and there are Israeli businessmen trying to get economic activity going in parts of the West Bank and so on. And of course there is the huge problem of you cannot leave out Gaza, and Gaza is a very suffering kind of collective punishment place. That's what it is. And there are very real issues that are very troubling. But I don't think we're bringing out enough that kind of linking. And it happened in Belfast, and it happened in South Africa. And the role of the business community, the role of women's groups, the role of faith-based, and the role of those who take a role. I mean, outgoing Prime Minister Olmert said some very far-sighted things, maybe because he's coming to the end of his term. But there are those who are trying to create that space. And what I do find is that there is a perception, and this is another thing that has to be addressed, that the United States is no longer, as it was, an honest broker trying to help a solution. It is seen more and more, especially in the Middle East, to be partisan. And I think it's absolutely vital that it goes back to being that honest broker, because the United States is a vital honest broker. And there are new allies. There's the role of Doha, there's the role of Turkey. There are new players trying to solve pieces of the problem, whether it's in relation to Syria, whether it's in relation, and I think we have to try to get a different kind of momentum that isn't so divided in the way it has been, and where the United States is not seen to be fair-minded.
Can I come in on this?
I actually, let's stay on this subject for a minute. So you spent a fair amount of time there.
Yeah, I've been involved in this problem since Camp David I. It seems to me that by now it's very clear that while both the Israeli and the Palestinian public opinions have moved towards a more conciliatory and realistic understanding of what a genuine settlement ought to involve, the political elites of both sides are too weak to make decisive decisions. And if the United States persists, not only in what Mary said, namely being somewhat more partial to Israel than to the Palestinians, but essentially in being a kind of passive advocate of peace. You know, here's a roadmap to nowhere, please proceed along it. In the meantime, negotiate with each other, and we hope peace will emerge. We'll miss the opportunity for peace, because actually we're getting to a stage in which pretty soon it will be impossible to create two states, to disentangle the Israelis from the Palestinians, and before too long there'll be more Palestinians than the Israelis. And on the agenda will not be two states, but perhaps something like South Africa, a single state by majority vote. And that will mean, in many respects, the death of Israel. So I think we have to move more energetically. And the fact of the matter is, the basic fact of the matter is, that unless the United States states clearly that there are certain parameters to an eventual peace settlement that have to be respected by the two sides, by their elites, by their governments, there'll be no movement. And these parameters are well known, basically accepted, but not articulated by the United States openly and decisively. And there are essentially four points. The first is very painful for the Palestinians, very painful for the Palestinians. No right of return. We cannot expect Israel to commit suicide for the sake of peace by simply saying the refugees can come back. So that has to be swallowed by the Palestinians, and one can work out arrangements of compensation, resettlement, etc. The second point, very bitter pill for the Israelis to swallow, but without which there will be no peace that is really viewed as legitimate and therefore lasting, and that is the genuine sharing of Jerusalem. Jerusalem has to be the capital of two states. Still a united city in some fashion. There are different plans for making that possible, with the Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, but also the Palestinian flag over the mosque with the golden dome, and real sharing of the old city. The third point, 67 lines, with some mutually accepted, equitable arrangements to accommodate the heavily urbanized blocks of Israeli settlements right on the edge of the 67 lines, but the dismantling of all further in and mutual territorial exchanges. And the fourth, a demilitarized Palestinian state, and I have publicly advocated including US troops on the Jordan River so that the Israelis feel they have strategic depth, which is what they're worried about. That statement would really give a shove to the process, especially if it was stated authoritatively, especially if the United States committed itself as being in favor of it and says that its relations with the parties to the conflict will be affected by the degree of their willingness to accept this. And the next president has to do it in the first year, when he has maximum domestic political support, is least vulnerable to domestic political pressures. If we do this, I think there is a chance of peace, real peace, and an enduring peace. If we don't do it, I think we're going to return to the same paralysis, but in the meantime, the situation gets worse, and the two-state solution, peaceful resolution, becomes more and more remote. And as Mary said, it is interesting that Prime Minister Olmert has more or less in his statement embraced every single one of these four principles without numbering them the way I have. And that's hopeful, but that's also an argument for us to move decisively.
Nick, you have some thoughts on that?
I mean, I largely agree. I mean, the degree to which the Middle East issue poisons relations and perceptions of the U.S. in so much of the world really does make it an essential foreign policy priority. I wouldn't bet on success in the first year, but I think there is hope. And success is also measured not only by reaching a deal, but by trying. And even if there is a sense that the U.S. is pushing for a peace, then at least perceptions improve and we get more political capital in Indonesia and Pakistan and Malaysia, all over the world.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the role of the media earlier, and there were a couple of questions from students, and I wondered if I could just pull one of them out, which is a little, you began to answer it earlier, I think, with your own travels and the own passion which you bring to this subject. But the question really amounted to your sneakers and cell phones. How do you engage self-centered audiences to take seriously places that are far away with unpronounceable names, don't seem to have any direct interest for the United States? How do you communicate with largely self-centered audiences in the United States? How do you grab their attention?
I actually rely, I mean, there's been a lot of really interesting work in the field of social psychology about precisely this issue. And the lessons are overwhelming that on these issues, empathy is not a rational process, and that's a mistake that aid groups and humanitarians often make. For example, one experiment by a bunch of psychologists involved asking people to donate to Rokia, who was a 7-year-old girl in Mali who was malnourished, or you could donate to, there were various versions of this experiment. You could donate alternatively to 21 million hungry children in West Africa. And of course, everybody wanted to donate to Rokia. Nobody wanted to help 21 million people. But even if you asked people to donate to Rokia and, I forget, there was a boy his same age, the moment you expanded it to 2 people, then donations dropped. If you talked about Rokia and provided some background context about malnutrition, then donations dropped. If you asked people to do math problems before they encountered Rokia, donations dropped. I mean, it's not a rational process. It's really a function of building some kind of emotional connection. If you ask people to donate to a $200,000 fund for pediatric cancer, then in one version it would save the life of 1 child, in another version it would save the life of 8 children. People donated far more to save 1 child, even though it was only 1/8 as cost effective. So I think that often one of the problems is we say, Congo, 5 million people have died, you should care. And it has 0 impact. And I mean, if you look at my columns, that's one reason why, you know, I go to enormous lengths to try to find the equivalent of Rokia. And I think that, indeed, people can be made to care about Rokia and then throw Rokia into these larger problems. It's a question of storytelling, it's a question of photos and images and how we can relate. But you know, if you look at Darfur, there is, I mean, it's tragic what has gone on and the fact that you've had this genocide unfolding year after year, but there is also something fundamentally reassuring about the fact that across the country you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of students who are giving up their time, their money, and who care passionately about people in a region that they never heard of in the past, who are of a different religion, of a different skin color, without even making that much progress toward it. So I think that there is indeed some hope of building these kinds of connections. I just think that those of us who care about these issues need to change the way we go about it.
That's very good. We are supposed to end in 3 minutes, maybe 4 minutes. So let me ask one more question and let each of you have a short go at it. Al Gore used the word inconvenient truth. I don't know whether climate change is no longer inconvenient or convenient, but what 2 or 3 inconvenient truths would you like to see one of the presidential candidates mention sometime in the next 4 weeks and actually do something about early in 2009? Mary, may I start with you?
I would actually stick with Al Gore's inconvenient truth because I think all the indicators are that the situation is worse than we thought. And what I would add to the way in which he so eloquently puts it is there's a climate justice element. I was in Rwanda 3 weeks ago for a conference that had a long title, but the title almost tells a story. It was Climate Change, Adaptation, Sustainable Development and Human Rights. And it was a joint effort between the London School of Economics and the government of Rwanda, and President Kagame opened the conference, and there were various voices. The whole of Africa, and it's mainly South Africa, contributes 3.8% of the carbon emissions. But it is being devastated, and the Millennium Development Goals are being undermined, and all the people that Nick is describing and that I'm seeing as well are finding it so much harder. And the overall situation is absolute crisis. So I would hope that the incoming United States president will do something that is actually doable. We're now used to figures. I've got my head around, because it's repeated so often, $700 billion. And it doesn't seem so big anymore. And that's just for banks. The United States needs an equivalent, say $500 billion, on the steps to provide the new technologies and indeed the infrastructure here in the United States, but particularly the new green technologies. And then the justice element is transferring those technologies to the developing world and providing millions of customers, because that's where the people are and that's where the growth in population is going to be. Solar power, wind power, electricity infrastructure, so that those countries can somehow get over the injustice of having their attempts to become more viable set back by the livelihoods that we've wanted in this part of the world. It's a real justice issue. That's the inconvenient truth as far as I'm concerned, and it needs urgent addressing.
Zbigniew Brzezinski.
I think I would like the next president to say to the American people that the notion of ignorant self-indulgence as a way of life is no longer compatible with global realities. That we're serious about creating in the course of the 21st century a global community in which some of the basic social problems as well as cosmic problems are addressed. We have to ask ourselves very seriously whether both our ignorance about the world and our self-indulgence in our lifestyle are compatible with such notions. To put it very simply, if, for example, India or China are ever to have a way of life like ours, just think how many cars they'll have to have. Think of how we define the meaning of good life purely in material terms. And I think that inclination, which I call self-indulgence, is also perpetuated in America by a woeful ignorance about the world as a whole. And that makes it very difficult for any president to have an intelligent policy in which America is asked to lead by example and inspiration, and is not only reacting to external threats that mobilize the public. Unfortunately, in my own dealings with foreign affairs, one thing which has struck me the most was that precisely because we are the #1 global power and a democracy at the same time, it is very difficult for policymakers successfully to formulate an intelligent foreign policy, because the public doesn't support it, doesn't understand it. And we have woeful ignorance in this country about global history, about global geography. And I think the next president, one of his very important roles, will be to educate the American public about the power, but the real power realities of the 21st century. What is unique about it and what is no longer sustainable. And that will require a rethinking of some of the basic premises of what we define the good life to be.
That would indeed be inconvenient.
It would be
Kristof, the last word.
One would be that one inconvenient truth, I think, is that when we face the next global crisis or confrontation, as we will, that instead of the instinctive reach for the military toolbox, which does indeed need to be there, we need to amplify and improve our diplomatic toolbox and build up that toolbox. I mean, it's striking that the United States has more people in its military bands than we have in our diplomatic corps. The staff of the New York City Police Department is approximately 5 times the staff of the Foreign Service. And, you know, it's hard to address all these problems and make progress on them when you have a diplomatic corps that is so constrained. And the other thing that I would love to see the next president address is the idea of greater public service. There is an interest among young people, and I'm sure you see it on campus, in doing something larger. And I always find that when people go and, whether it's an encore career late in life, or whether it's Peace Corps kind of a thing, or as social entrepreneurs as students, but that those kinds of efforts, they actually have a fairly mixed record in helping the people who they start out trying to help. But they have an incredibly successful record in helping oneself. And I think that, and educating oneself about the world. And I think that that is something that John Kennedy did extraordinarily successful a generation ago. I'd love to see the next president take up that call for more public service and encourage it and create institutions to feed upon that.
Oh, thank you. I'd just like to close by reminding you that the next forum is on the 20th of October. You're welcome. Second thing is I want to thank, as Bill did, Vartan Gregorian for making all of this possible. And third, I'd like to thank Mary, Nick, and Zbigniew for their